Before the sun clears the horizon, engines are already running. The harbour smells of diesel and cold salt air. Somewhere in the pre-dawn grey, a vessel is moving. Not a large one, but it is doing exactly what a larger one cannot. On the water, size is not always an advantage. Sometimes what a port needs is something small, powerful, and precise. This is a harbour tugboat. In ports from Halifax to Prince Rupert, from St. John to Vancouver, these vessels perform one of the most technically demanding jobs in all of Canadian maritime operations. They maneuver ships. Time equals 200 milliseconds / greater than that weigh up to 300,000 tons. Ships that cannot stop themselves, cannot turn on their own, and cannot dock without assistance. The tugboat makes that possible. A standard Canadian harbour tug measures between 24 and 42 metres in length. It weighs between 300 and 800 tons. But what defines it is not its size, it is its bollard pull. That number measured in tons of force determines what the vessel can move. A working harbour tug in a major Canadian port typically generates between 40 and 80 tons of bollard pull. Some of the most powerful reach 100 tons or more. The harbour pilot boards the inbound vessel first. He or she takes the bridge, communicates with the port authority, and coordinates with the tug fleet waiting below. In Halifax, in winter, an inbound container ship may be carrying 4,000 TEUs. 4,000 20-foot equivalent container units. It arrives with a draft of 13 metres, moving slowly through water that sits just above freezing. The tugs are already positioned. 2 tugs take position, one at the bow, one at the stern. This is standard practice. The bow tug controls lateral movement as the ship enters the channel. The stern tug provides braking force and prevents the ship's propeller wash from pushing the hull sideways. The coordination between both crews, the pilot and port traffic control, happens entirely by radio. Voices, stay calm. There is no room for confusion here. The tugboat captain, standing at the helm of a vessel perhaps 30 meters long, is maneuvering something 300 meters ahead of him. His screens show speed, heading, water depth, and the real-time position of every vessel in the approach zone. Outside, time equals 200 milliseconds / greater than the temperature is -8 degrees Celsius. The wind is coming from the northwest at 25 knots. The water in the outer harbour has begun to form grease ice, the first thin, soupy layer that precedes solid freeze. Canadian ports are among the most demanding environments for harbour tug operations in the world. Halifax handles over 500 vessel calls annually, many of them in winter months when ice forms in the inner harbour and wind chill regularly drops below -20. The port of St. John, New Brunswick, sits at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, home to the highest tides on Earth. Time equals 250 milliseconds / greater than, with tidal fluctuations reaching 16 meters. Every docking here must account for a moving waterline. The tugs that work Canadian ports are not all the same. The older generation of harbour tugs used conventional single-screw propulsion. Effective, but with limited manoeuvrability. Modern ports demand something more capable. The azimuth stern-drive tug, known as the ASD tug, changed how port operations function. Its propulsion units can rotate 360 degrees, allowing the vessel to push, pull, or hold position in any direction without turning its hull. In Vancouver's inner harbour, the combination of heavy traffic, narrow channels, and strong tidal currents makes ASD tugs essential. The port handles over 3,000 vessel calls per year. Tankers, bulk carriers, container ships, and cruise vessels. When a fully loaded bulk carrier with a length of 225 meters and a beam of 32 meters enters the second Narrows rail bridge passage, the clearance on either side may be less than 20 meters. The tug holds it steady. The crew of a harbour tug is small, typically 4 to 5 people on a working shift. The captain handles propulsion and positioning. The mate assists and manages deck communications. Deckhands handle the lines, the heavy synthetic or wire ropes that connect the tug to the ship being assisted. Line handling in -15-degree air with wet gloves and steel ropes stiffened by cold is among the most physically demanding tasks in port work. The tug's engines are the core of everything. Most modern harbour tugs in Canada run on diesel-electric or direct diesel propulsion systems, producing between 3,000 and 6,000 brake horsepower. The sound inside the engine room is constant and deep, a vibration that moves through the hull, up through the steel deck plates, into the boots of anyone standing on them. These engines do not stop during a shift. When one job ends, the next begins. Not all tug work takes place in sheltered harbour waters. On Canada's east coast, offshore supply vessels and platform support ships operate in the open North Atlantic. When one of these vessels loses propulsion or requires emergency towing, ocean-going salvage tugs are dispatched. These are a different class entirely. Vessels of 60 to 80 meters built for open ocean work with Bollard pull ratings exceeding 150 tons and fuel capacity for extended transits. In the port of Prince Rupert, British Columbia, winter fog is as much a factor as wind or ice. The harbour sits at the edge of a deep fjord system, and when cold air meets warmer ocean water, visibility can drop to under 100 meters in minutes. Tugboat captains operating here rely on radar, AIS transponders, and decades of local knowledge. They know every rock, every current, every corner of this harbour the way a driver knows a familiar road. Except nothing here stays the same. Further north, time equals 250 milliseconds / greater than the work changes in character entirely. In Churchill, Manitoba, on the western shore of Hudson Bay, the shipping season lasts only from July through November. After that, the ice closes the port completely. During the open season, tugboats work in water that is already cold enough to pose survival risks within minutes of immersion. Crew cold water survival suits are not optional here. They are required equipment at all times on deck. The grain vessels that call at Churchill represent one of the more unusual cargo operations in Canadian maritime history. Prairie wheat, time equals 200 milliseconds / greater than harvested in Saskatchewan and Alberta, is transported north by rail to Churchill's terminal elevator, one of the largest grain storage facilities on Hudson Bay. Tugboats assist these vessels into the terminal berth, guiding them through shoal waters with depths sometimes as shallow as 9 meters under keel. There is very little margin for error. Tug captains in Canada are trained under some of the most rigorous certification programs in the world. Transport Canada requires officers to hold STCW certification, the standards of training, certification and watchkeeping for seafarers. Harbour tug. Masters specifically must complete endorsements in ship handling, towing operations and emergency response. Most working captains in major Canadian ports have 10 to 20 years of experience before they ever hold command of a tug in a restricted waterway. When a large tanker arrives at the Irving Oil Terminal in St. John, the stakes are immediately apparent. These vessels carry up to 120,000 tons of crude oil. A controlled, precise docking is not a preference, it is a safety requirement. The terminal sits in a tidal zone, and the tug fleet must account for a current that can run at 3 to 4 knots through the approaches, reversing direction with every tide cycle. Timing the operation to the tide is as critical as any equipment on board. The firefighting tug is a specific class found in most major Canadian ports. Designated FIFE Class 1 or Class 2 under international standards, these vessels carry high-capacity water monitors capable of projecting seawater at up to 2,400 cubic meters per hour. In a port fire involving a fuel tanker or chemical vessel, a conventional fireboat cannot always get close enough. The tug's maneuverability and low profile allow it to work in spaces no larger vessel can enter. On Canada's west coast, log towing represents a uniquely Canadian form of tug work that has existed for over 150 years. Rafts of timber, sometimes covering several acres, are assembled in coastal inlets and towed to sawmills by small, powerful tugs. In winter, these operations contend with Pacific storms, strong southeasterly winds, and swells that can reach 4 to 6 meters. The tug and its log boom may move only 3 to 4 knots. A journey of 200 nautical miles can take several days. The mechanical connection between a tug and the vessel it is handling is a system of considerable complexity. A tow line on a harbour tug may be composed of high-modulus polyethylene fibre, a synthetic material that weighs a fraction of steel wire, but approaches similar braking strength, sometimes exceeding 200 tons. In cold weather, these lines stiffen. They must be inspected every shift for cuts, abrasion, and UV degradation. A line failure during a docking procedure with a fully loaded tanker is not a recoverable event. The Seaspan fleet operating along the British Columbia coast represents one of the largest tug and barge operations in Canada. With over 130 vessels including harbour tugs, ocean-going tugs, deck barges, and self-propelled barges, the company supports coastal communities that have no road or rail access. For these communities, the tug and barge is not a convenience. It is the only supply line. Fuel, food, construction materials, and industrial equipment all arrive by water. At the port of Montreal, the St. Lawrence River presents its own set of winter challenges. The river freezes partially every year, and the Canadian Coast Guard operates icebreakers to maintain the shipping channel. But even with an open channel, incoming vessels encounter dense Fraser ice, small ice crystals that form in turbulent water and can accumulate against a ship's hull, clogging seawater intakes. Tugs in Montreal must work in these conditions throughout the winter sailing season, which now extends year-round. The noise aboard a working tug is unlike almost anything in land-based industry. Below decks, the diesels run at a constant frequency that registers more as a physical sensation than a sound. On deck, the sound of rope under load, a low, resonant groaning, layers over the mechanical backdrop. Wind across open water adds its own note. In winter, the creak of ice against the hull comes and goes, unpredictable and hollow. Crew members rarely raise their voices. Everything is communicated in short, clear statements. Ice conditions in Canadian ports are classified and monitored by the Canadian Ice Service, a division of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Ice charts are updated daily during the winter months and distributed to port authorities, vessel operators, and tug companies. The classifications range from open water to consolidated multi-year ice. For harbour tug operations, even thin new ice, 10 to 15 centimetres, can affect the hydrodynamics of the water around a vessel and change the behaviour of the tow. There are moments in harbour tug work when conditions move beyond what procedure accounts for. A sudden wind shift during a docking, a line parting under load, a tanker responding slower than calculated. In these moments, the captain's judgment takes precedence over everything. Time equals 300 milliseconds / greater than. There are no replays. The hull of a fully loaded 300-meter vessel carries enormous kinetic energy even at 1 knot. At 2 knots, a collision with a berth structure can cause damage measured in millions of dollars and injuries that do not always allow for full recovery. The economic function of the harbour tug is difficult to overstate. Canada's port system moves over 340 million tons of cargo annually. Nearly every vessel involved in that movement requires tug assistance for at least part of its port call. The arrival, the shift from one berth to another, or the departure. Without tugboats, container terminals, grain terminals, coal terminals, liquid bulk terminals, and dry bulk facilities across the country would cease to function as efficiently as they do. The tug is infrastructure, not equipment. On the Strait of Georgia, between Vancouver Island and the mainland, tug and barge traffic moves continuously. Some barges carry liquid asphalt, some carry aggregate, others move containerized freight to communities not served by ferry. At night, these barges are often the only moving objects on the dark water. The tug's masthead light moves slowly through the black, maybe 4 knots, pulling several thousand tons behind it. The crew on board may be just 2 people, working watch on watch for days at a time. The relationship between a harbour tug and the vessel pilot is one built on constant communication and mutual trust. The pilot has authority over the ship's navigation, but the tug captain has authority over his own vessel. When the pilot calls for a push or a pull, the tug captain interprets that command through the physical reality of his own position, his line angle, the current running beneath him, and the response lag he has learned over years of operation. The execution belongs to him. Some of the oldest harbour tug companies in Canada trace their origins to the late 1800s. The period when Canadian Pacific's rail lines first reached the Pacific coast and Pacific trade began to expand rapidly. The tugs of that era were steam-powered, smaller, and operated by crews who had little in the way of electronic navigation. What they had, instead, was intimate knowledge of local waters, tide tables, and the kind of judgment that comes only from years of working the same harbour in all conditions. Modern harbour tugs in Canada are increasingly hybrid or fully electric assisted. Wärtsilä, Damon, and Robert Allen Limited, a Vancouver-based naval architecture firm, have all developed designs for low-emission tugs intended to reduce port area air quality impacts. Some Canadian ports under Transport Canada environmental agreements now require vessels operating in harbour zones to comply with Tier 4 emission standards. The next generation of tug is being built now, and it will be quieter, cleaner, and still just as powerful. The Salish Sea, encompassing the Strait of Georgia, Juan de Fuca Strait, and Puget Sound, is one of the most ecologically sensitive bodies of water in North America. Tug and barge operations here must comply with Fisheries and Oceans Canada regulations governing wake impacts, anchor use in spawning zones, and response protocols in the event of a spill. The integration of environmental compliance into daily tug operations is now standard procedure. The paperwork alone constitutes a significant part of every captain's administrative day. In Kitimat, British Columbia, a new terminal handling liquefied natural gas exports began operations in 2025. The facility exports LNG to Asian markets via a fleet of specialized carriers. Each carrier, over 290 meters in length and carrying up to 170,000 cubic meters of LNG, must be guided into a purpose-built berth by a fleet of tugs purpose-selected for the task. LNG carrier docking is among the highest consequence port operations in Canadian maritime. Cold, dense, and pressurized cargo leaves no tolerance for error. The crew rotation cycle on a harbour tug differs from offshore vessels. Harbour tug crews typically work 12-hour shifts, often on a week-on, week-off schedule. For ocean tugs operating on coastal routes, the rotation may be 2 weeks on and 2 off. The physical environment of a tug, constant vibration, noise, confined spaces, irregular deck motion, demands recovery time. Over a career, tug workers develop a particular kind of body knowledge. They move differently on vessels. They read water differently. They sense mechanical changes before instruments register them. Halifax, as Canada's primary deep-water port on the Atlantic, handles some of the largest vessel calls in the country. Post-Panamax container ships, 366 meters long with a beam of 51 meters, arrive here from Europe and Asia. These vessels have a displacement of over 100,000 tons when loaded. When one of these ships enters the outer approaches in winter, with 25-knot winds from the southwest and a 2-meter chop, the tug fleet goes to work before the pilot even boards. The approach is managed, not assumed. There are tugs that work in places most Canadians have never heard of. Nanisivik. On Baffin Island, one of the most remote naval facilities in the world, requires periodic supply and maintenance support. Pond Inlet, Resolute, Arctic Bay. These are communities above the 72nd parallel where summer ice conditions determine whether a vessel can reach port at all. When a tug operates in these waters, it is beyond the coverage range of most conventional search and rescue assets. Self-sufficiency is not a philosophy, it is an operational requirement. The escort tug is a distinct function from the harbour tug. In fjords, narrow straits and restricted channels, particularly in BC's Inside Passage, fully loaded tankers are required by law to have escort tugs in continuous attendance. The escort tug does not necessarily maintain a physical connection to the tanker. It holds position nearby, ready to intervene within seconds if the larger vessel loses steering or propulsion. It is, in effect, a 60-ton mechanical guardian moving at 12 knots through some of the most beautiful and ecologically sensitive water on Earth. The weather patterns of the North Atlantic make tug operations off Newfoundland and Labrador among the most demanding in the hemisphere. Extratropical cyclones, the maritime equivalent of land-based storms, can generate sustained winds above 60 knots and waves exceeding 12 meters. Offshore support tugs based out of St. John's, Newfoundland, must be designed to maintain seakeeping in conditions that would halt operations for any vessel not specifically built for the North Atlantic. Their hulls are reinforced, their stabilizers are oversized, their range is measured in weeks, not days. A quiet afternoon in the port of Halifax, the last container ship of the day has been brought to berth. The tugs have cleared the turning basin and returned to their moorings along the pier. Lines are checked, fuel levels are logged, engine hours are recorded. The crew on watch takes their position. The crew coming off watch completes the handover. In an hour it will be dark. After dark, the night tide will bring another inbound vessel. The harbour never empties. The work does not have an off-season. What is easy to miss about the harbour tug is how much goes unseen. The maintenance, the inspections mandated every 5 years by Transport Canada classification surveys. The dry dock periods when a vessel's hull is inspected for corrosion, cracks in the steel frames, wear on the propulsion bearings. A harbour tug operating in cold Canadian waters faces accelerated material fatigue. The freeze-thaw cycle stresses metal. Salt penetrates every joint. The tug that docks a tanker in Halifax this winter was built to handle this, and it is constantly maintained to keep handling it. By morning, the harbour is already active again. A bulk carrier is at anchor in the roads, waiting for a berth to clear. The pilot boat is underway. The tug crews have taken their positions. Ice has formed overnight along the dock edges, a thin grey skin over the water that the tug cuts through without pause. There will be other ships, other tides, other nights, another season of cold that presses against the hull and asks again whether the machinery and the crew are ready. They are. They always are. This work does not stop.